Every 7 minutes in America, a black child is punished by the system. But what happens when the system doesn't just punish, it kills? In 1944, a 14-year-old black boy named George Stinney Jr. was executed by the state of South Carolina. He became the youngest person to be put to death in the United States in the 20th century. And his only real crime was being a black child in a world that refused to see his humanity. Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it works quietly, through courtrooms that don't hear, through judges who don't see, through systems that were never built to protect certain people. George lived in Alcolu, South Carolina, a small segregated mill town where railroad tracks divided the white side from the black side. On March 23, 1944, two white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames, went out riding their bicycles. They never came home. The town's grief quickly turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into accusation. And in that town, being a young black boy near the scene was all it took to become the perfect target. If you believe these stories should be told so the world never forgets, subscribe now, because silence allows history to repeat itself. George and his little sister, Am, were seen earlier that day near the girls, speaking briefly as they passed on their bikes. Hours later, their bodies were found in a shallow ditch. Without witnesses, without evidence, police arrested George the very next day. They claimed he had confessed, but there was no written statement, no recording, no lawyer present, and no parent by his side. His sister would later testify that George had been home with her at the time of the murders, but no one in power wanted to hear that. His family, fearing for their own safety, fled town after his arrest. The trial was a farce. It lasted just 2 hours. The jury, 12 white men, deliberated for 10 minutes. Not one witness was called in George's defense. His appointed lawyer made no objections, called no experts, and barely spoke. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, death by electric chair. George was just 90 pounds, too small for the chair built for grown men. On June 16, 1944, they led him into the execution chamber with a Bible in his hands. He was so small that prison staff had to stack a Bible and a few books to raise him high enough for the electrodes. When the switch was pulled, the mask slipped from his face, revealing his wide, terrified eyes. Witnesses saw tears on his cheeks as 2,400 volts surged through his body. There was no forensic investigation, no cross-examination of the so-called confession, no consideration of George's age or mental state. In fact, years later, historians would point out that George likely didn't even understand what was happening to him. His execution was less about justice and more about sending a message that in the Jim Crow South, a black child's life could be taken without question. For decades, George's family carried the weight of his name marked as murderer. It wasn't until 2014, 70 years later, that a South Carolina judge vacated his conviction, stating that he had not received a fair trial. George was declared innocent, but the ruling could not give back the years his family spent in grief, nor the life stolen from him. His story stands as one of the most haunting examples of how justice can be twisted into a weapon. Stories like George's remind us why speaking up matters. If you believe the world needs to remember these moments, subscribe now, because every voice against injustice counts. George Stinney Jr. wasn't just a victim of a broken system. He was a child whose life was taken before it even began. Share this story, and watch our next video. Another case where the truth was buried, but the fight for justice still burns.